for starters, we need a way to change the names, the usernames, and the image. We also need a way to query our conversations. We need a way to search users. We need a way to fetch the messages. We also need a way to send a message. So yeah, let's just chip away at that. So we can, let's open up the auth route. Close this, make this a little bit bigger. We can rename this to, rename file. Let's rename this to user. Okay, and then change this. So instead of auth router, we're gonna have user router. And we're gonna change this to user. And then change this guy to user router. Okay, so first thing, we need to be able to change our usernames, our images, and our name. So let's say change user data. This is going to be a protected procedure because obviously we need a session to be able to change our own data. And then we're going to have an input here. It's going to be a Z object. So we need Zod. So let's import Z from Zod. Okay. And so here we need a username, or let's start with name. That's going to be a string. It can be nullish, meaning it can have null or undefined. Nullable is it can have a value or null. And then we're going to have a username, which is also a string, nullish. And then we have an image, which is a string, nullish. Okay, and then we need a mutation because we're actually mutating data. And inside here, we have a function. Okay, and inside this function, we can actually get the inputs. So we can get the username, the name, the image, and we need the context. Okay, so now we can say return context Prisma user update. And we're updating where the ID equals the session user ID. And then we want the data. So here we're just passing name, username, and image. Right. And so the reason why I have everything nullish, so that way if we just want to change the name or whatever, we can use the same mutation to change anything, and we don't have to pass them all in when we change them. Okay. So another thing we need is to be able to search users. And wait, before I do that, we're going to say select. Say ID true, name true, username true, and image true. This way we're not sending back any sensitive data. We don't want to be sending back emails and whatnot when we don't have to. And so for users, we're going to have a protected procedure, inputs. This is also going to be an object. And we're going to say user. It's going to be a string. And this time it's going to be a query. Okay, and so now again, we're going to grab the input. We're going to grab that user. And we're also going to grab the context. All right. And here, what we want to do is return context Prisma user find many. And we want to find the users where their name or their username contains that user. So we're going to say or name contains user. And we're going to say mode insensitive. That way, if we pass any uppercase or lowercase letters, it doesn't really matter. And then we're going to say username contains user, also insensitive. And then we don't want to return ourselves. So we're going to say not ID equals the session user ID. Okay. And again, we only want to select the ID, name. Matter of fact, let me just copy this. Whoa. Okay, let's try that again. Okay. So here we're just querying all the users, and we're only finding the users where the name or the username contains that user text. We have it mode insensitive, so we don't care about uppercase or lowercase. And we don't want to return ourselves, so we're saying not. The ID is the session user ID, and we're only selecting ID, name, username, and image. All right, so now we need a way to query our conversations. So let's go to example. Let's rename this to, say, chat. And then we want this to be the chat router. This to be chat. And this also to be chat. Okay. So here we can say conversations equals protected procedure. And we want to query, get the context. And we want to say return context Prisma conversation user, because again, we only know our conversations through our conversation user. We're going to say find many, and we're going to find them where the user ID equals the session user ID. And we want to include the conversation. And from that conversation, we want to include the conversation users. And from those users, we want to include the user. And from that user, we want to select the ID, name, image, username. Again, so that way we're not passing back any sensitive data. And then we also want to include the last message. All right. And then we want to order all this by the conversation last message ID descending. Okay. Now I know in the front end, I said we were going to be returning messages instead of last message, but I lied. We could do something like this where we can say messages, and then we could say order by ID, and we could say descending, and then we could say take one. That's another way. So we're just going to say take the last message of our messages. But I think this is cleaner doing it this way. Okay. So we have our conversations query. We have our user query. What else do we need? One thing that would be helpful is if we actually have a conversation with the user, we don't want to start a new conversation. So maybe we want to search that conversation, right? And so let's say find conversation. And let's make this a protected procedure. I mean, pretty much everything's going to be a protected procedure because we need the user ID. And so this we're going to take input. And we want this guy to be an object. And we're going to take the user ID, which is going to be a string. Because we basically want to say, do I already have a conversation with this user, right? And so it's going to be a query. We have a function. And we're going to say, we're going to pull out that user ID. And we're also going to pull out the context. Okay. And inside here, we want to say const. Let me save this. Get some formatting. Close this out. And let's say const conversation users equals await context Prisma conversation user group by, we're going to say by conversation ID where user ID and user ID context session user ID. Then we're going to say having user ID count equals 2. And then we're going to say if we have conversation users, so we're going to say conversation users dot length. So if we get an array back that's not empty, then we're going to return conversation user sub 0, conversation user ID, conversation ID, or null. All right. And we want this to be async. Okay. Basically, we're saying, let's query our conversation users that have these user IDs. So the user ID we passed in our session user. And based on the ones we get back, we want to group by the conversation ID. And within that group, if it has 2 user IDs in it, then we know we have a conversation between these 2 users. And we're going to return that conversation ID down here. So in other words, let's say we have user 1. So let's just say U1, and it has the conversations, let's say C1 and C2. And then we have U2, which has the conversations of, let's just say C1. Now, when we query our conversation users and we group them by the conversation, the first group would be C1 that has user 2, and then C1 that has user 1. And the other group would just be C2 that has user 1. right? And so now looking at this, we can say, well, this group has 2 user IDs. So therefore, there must be a conversation happening between these 2 users. And so we take that conversation ID, which in this case is C1, and we return that. And so that way we can fetch our messages with that conversation ID, which we can do now. So let's go down here. Let's say messages. Go ahead and center this. Let's also make this a little bit bigger. And let's say protected procedure, inputs. We want an object. We want to pass a conversation ID, right? Which would be a string. And then this is going to be a query. Okay. We want the input from that, which is the conversation ID. And we also want the context. So inside here, we can say return context Prisma message, find many, where conversation ID. And then we can say order by ID ascending. So that way we get our messages in order. And for security, we actually can make sure this user belongs to this conversation because we don't want any user passing a conversation ID and then being able to see all the messages. So we can say await context Prisma conversation user, find unique or throw. And we can say user ID where user ID conversation, user ID equals the context session user ID, and the conversation ID equals the one we passed in. And then we want to make this asynchronous. All right. And so here we're basically saying, before we return the messages, let's make sure that this user actually belongs to this conversation. And if they don't, we'll throw an error. But if they do, we'll get to here and we'll return the messages for that conversation. Okay. And then last but not least, we need to actually send messages. So let's say send message. This is going to be a protected procedure. Have an input, which is going to be a Z object. We're going to have a conversation ID, which can be nullish because we might not have a conversation yet. And then we have a message text, which is going to be a string. And then we have a user ID, which is also going to be a string. And nullish, because we only want to pass this if we're creating a new conversation. So let me go ahead and center this. And then say mutation. And here we want our input. So message text, conversation ID, and user ID. And we also want the context. Okay. Let me go ahead and wrap this. And so if we don't have a conversation ID, then we know we need to create one. And if we don't have a user ID, then we don't have a recipient. So we can say throw new error, no recipients passed. All right. And so now we can create our conversation. Unfortunately, we can't create our last message with our conversation. So if we're going to say await context Prisma conversation create. and we try to say last message creates message text and user ID, we just get errors here saying string is not assignable to undefined. So we actually have to make this messages. And I think that's because Prisma doesn't have a way to create the message and then set the last message ID, which means we have to do this in 2 steps, which also means this should be in a transaction because we don't want our conversation creation to be successful, but then we're updating the last message ID, that fails. So then our database will be out of sync. So what we can do is we can actually turn on the interactive transactions with Prisma. So if we go up here and we say preview features equals interactive transactions, and then we run Prisma generates, we'll now be able to use a transaction instance in Prisma. So this will essentially allow us to do this where we say transactions, and we get a transaction instance. And then so now anything that we call with this instance, if it fails, everything will be rolled back. So if we have this conversation that we're creating here, right? Save that. And then we do something like TRX conversation update, and this fails, but this TRX conversation create succeeds, that will roll back because something in this transaction failed. So now we can finish this and say, we also want to create our conversation users along with that message. And that'll be create many. And we want to pass the user ID of our recipient and the user ID of our session user. Okay. And then we want to include our messages in our return. So that way we can now say, await conversation updates, data last message ID equals conversation messages sub 0 ID, where ID equals conversation ID. Okay. All right. So basically, we're creating a new conversation. We're doing this in a transaction because we're doing a create and update. And so we want to ensure that if one of these fails, that everything will roll back. And so we're creating our message. We're creating our conversation users. And then we're finally updating our conversation with the last message ID of that message that we created. Okay, and so now if we do have our conversation ID, then we essentially want to do the same thing. We're going to say const Prisma transaction async transaction. But instead of creating a conversation, we're just going to create a message. So we're going to say const message equals await TRX message create. That's going to have message text. the user who sent it, which is our session user, and then the conversation ID that we passed. Okay. And then we want to update that conversation. So let's say TRX conversation update. Set the last message ID to message ID, where conversation ID, or where ID is the past conversation ID. Okay. That's complaining because this is not asynchronous. Okay. And we're returning this here because we want to return actually this conversation. So after we update it, we want to return it. So that way we know the conversation ID for our new messages to query. But then here, once we send a message, we're automatically going to requery for those messages. We don't need to return our conversation because we already know our conversation ID. And for security measures, we can actually make sure that this user belongs to this conversation. So that way a user just can't send messages to any conversation if they have a conversation ID. So we can wrap this guy in a promise all. That way we don't have to wait on making sure that this user is part of this conversation. We can just query at the same time. TRX conversation user, find unique or throw, where user conversation ID, user ID equals the session user ID, and conversation ID equals the conversation ID that we passed. And then we also need to make this an array for the return. Okay. And so now if this throws an error, then that means one of our transactions threw an error and everything will roll back. So if this user is not a part of this conversation, then we won't send a message. All right, so we have, let's go to the top. We have our conversations query. We have our find conversation query. Then we have our messages query. And then we finally have our send message mutation. So that's pretty much our tRPC logic for our chats. The only thing we're missing is our WebSocket stuff, which we'll do a little bit later. And we also have our change theme logic, which we can do right now. So we can just say change user theme, protect the procedure. It's an input. It's going to be an object. It's going to have a theme, which is an enum. That can be light or dark. And we're going to say mutation. Get the theme from the input. And get the context. And we're going to say return context Prisma user update data theme where ID equals context session user ID. And we're going to say select, let's just say select ID and theme. right, looking good. So let's go ahead and implement our login logic with Nextauth, and then we can connect our endpoints.